Hello, comrades, and welcome to this first video on the Russian Revolution area of Study 1. Now, this video will explore Imperial Russia before the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II, who was the reigning monarch at the time of the 1917 revolution. So we're actually looking at giving a context of what Imperial Russia was like before our area of study begins with the coronation of the Tsar in May 1896. So we've got quite a lot to get through, so let's get straight into it. Firstly, let's look at the land and its people. So the Russian Empire was enormous. It spanned 8,000 kilometers east to west, 3,000 kilometers north to south, and also spanned across 11 different time zones. This presented a unique challenge in that communication and defense was incredibly difficult. At the same time, while the Russian Empire was enormous, it also experienced huge population growth, which presents another challenge in that with a growing population, infrastructure and food and resources need to match that growth. So if it does not, then that could lead to famine, it could lead to poverty, and a growing gap between rich and poor. So the population grew massively. In 1815, the population was 40 million people. By 1897, the population had more than tripled to 126 million people, and by 1910, it had grown again to 161 million people. The Russian Empire also contained a diverse ethnic population with 60 different recognized nationalities, a diverse array of languages, religious beliefs, customs, and cultures. Now, despite this diversity, from the 1890s, the government carried out a deliberate policy of Russification, which meant that they were forcing the Russian language and customs upon ethnic minorities, which, as you can imagine, was not very popular for these minorities. So here's a map of the Russian Empire. Now, this actually is not a very accurate map because up here it says Leningrad. That tells us that this happened after the 1917 revolution. That if this was an accurate map of the Russian Empire before the revolution, that would say St. Petersburg. So we've got St. Petersburg up here. We've got Moscow here, Kiev over here. The Volga region. Now, most of the action during the Russian Revolution happens in these much more highly densely populated areas in European Russia. Now, there are things that happen across the empire. However, for the most part, certainly the huge revolutionary action that we see from 1905 to 1917 takes place largely in this densely populated area here. So in terms of social classes, the 1897 census categorized the Russian people into 5 general social classes. We've got the ruling class, which made up 0.5% of the population, the upper class, making up 12% of the population, the commercial or middle classes, which made up 1.5% of the population, the proletariat working class, and I'll explain what proletariat means soon, made up 4% of the population, and the largest by far social class was the peasants, who made up 82% of the population. Let's dig a bit deeper into each of these social classes. So, starting with the peasants, 82% of the 1897 population was made up of peasants. And as such, farming really dominated the economy. Russia exported wheat primarily, and so farming was a crucial aspect of the Russian economy. Land was distributed by the village commune, otherwise known as the mer, and decision-making, including what crops should be sown and farming techniques, which were quite outdated, was made collectively by village elders. By 1900, around half the peasant population produced just enough to feed themselves, while only 16% produced a surplus to be handed over to the government in the form of taxes. Peasants were generally conservative, lacked formal education, and their lives were governed by the teachings of the church. Before 1861, the nobility owned peasants that worked their farms. This is through a system known as serfdom, which is basically slave ownership of peasants. However, in 1861, so well before our study, but it is relevant to our study. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II introduced the Emancipation Reform, freeing the serfs from their serfdom, though they still had to pay heavy annual taxes, forcing many into debt. Now, there is a method to the madness of the colors on my screen. Red is statistics, orange is key terms or policies or documents, and actually the Emancipation Reform should be in orange. That's why I'm saying it now. Blue is generally quotes, so that's why that shouldn't be in blue, and yellow is dates. All right, so that's the peasants. The working class. So due to limited development of heavy industry, the proletariat, which in Marxist thought is Karl Marx referred to the industrial working class as the proletariat. They only made up 4% of Russia's population, so a very small percentage of the population. However, these industrial workers were concentrated in specific areas in major cities, meaning that they had a greater capacity to influence authorities than peasants did as they lived in rural areas. There were only 2 pieces of factory legislation to protect labor. In 1885, a piece of legislation was released that prohibited nighttime employment of women and children. And in 1897, legislation restricted the working day to 11.5 hours. So as this shows, the fact that there were only 2 pieces of legislation shows that workers were not very well respected and they didn't have very good working or living conditions. Small workshops were excluded from these 2 pieces of legislation as well, which is significant as it was largely small workshops that most proletariat workers worked in these small workshops. So they weren't actually included in this legislation, meaning that people worked longer than 11.5 hours. Women and children did often work at night. Workers were also denied legal right to insurance, which meant that if they were injured on the job, then they would generally only receive a few rubles compensation and potentially be maimed for the rest of their life. Strikes were illegal. Trade unions were illegal until 1905. And after 1905, strikes increased to the point that 3/4 of the factory workforce went on strike in 1905 to 1906. Again, that should be in red because it's a statistic. But yeah, 3/4 of the factory workforce striked in the revolutionary years of 1905 to 6. The next group is the middle classes, so commercial and professional middle classes. They made up 1.5% of the population. By commercial classes, we mean business people, traders, and shop owners. By professional, we mean lawyers, engineers, teachers, etc. These middle classes had a good standard of living and many opportunities for social advancement. This social group produced reformist and revolutionary groups such as the Union of Unions, the Union of Liberation, and later political parties such as the Cadets and the Octoberists, who we'll explore later. Within this group were known as the intelligentsia, i.e. the educated classes in society. And from the intelligentsia came many of the key revolutionaries that we will look at who led the revolution, including Leon Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin. All of them came from these middle classes, which is interesting because they advocated for the proletariat working classes. And the final group we're looking at are the upper and ruling class. So the upper class made up 12% of the population. They included the nobility, hereditary landowners, i.e. people who inherited land, industrialists, church leaders, and military officers. The ruling class was made up of the Tsar and the royal family, high-ranking members of government. The ruling class was the smallest but wealthiest group, and these groups, the upper and ruling classes, had all the political power and influence. So, as we can see, the Russian Empire was incredibly unequal. There were the peasants at the bottom, the proletariat working classes not much higher than them, and then there was a great disparity in wealth, with the middle and upper and ruling classes having all the power and all the wealth. Now, let's have a look at the Tsarist regime, the way that the government was set up. So the Russian Empire was an autocracy, meaning that all political authority was held by the reigning monarch, known as the Tsar, who ruled by divine right. And by divine right, we mean they were ordained by God to rule. Many Russians referred to the Tsar as their, quote, little father. Tsars were expected to be fearsome and mighty, as well as gentle and caring. The Tsarist regime was made up of a number of different groups. So the Tsar was advised by the state council of members appointed by the Tsar. There was no democracy under the Tsarist regime. The Tsar also had a committee of ministers who were in charge of departments such as commerce, education, and finance. So these sorts of departments all had, you had your Minister of Commerce, your Minister of the Military, etc. A weakness of the Tsarist regime was that the direction of its policies and the confidence of its authority depended entirely on the individual character of the Tsar. By that, I mean that a decisive, intelligent, self-aware, strong, I've already said intelligent, a Tsar who had all of those qualities would generally strengthen the autocracy, whereas a weak-willed or an uncertain or a Tsar that was not ready to rule would leave the autocracy vulnerable to challenges. Now, adding on to the makeup of the government and the makeup of the Tsarist regime, Russia had a massive military force. It was the largest permanent army in Europe. It was used to defend the empire, as well as to enforce domestic security, which will become relevant in our next topic, whereby in times of unrest, the Tsar might unleash his troops against his own people. Russia also had a large and formidable navy, another thing that will be mentioned in our next topic when we look at the Russo-Japanese War. The Tsarist regime had two distinct police forces, those being the regular police and the Okhrana. So the regular police dealt with law and order, while the Okhrana dealt with agitators and political crimes. So they were sort of like the secret police. Since 1613, every Tsar had come from the Romanov family. So it was a dynasty, the Romanovs. And the last of the Romanovs was Tsar Nicholas II. So let's have a look at the famine crisis of the 1890s. So in 1891, a large portion of Russia was hit by famine, which was followed by an outbreak of cholera and typhus that killed up to 400,000 people by 1893. This created tension between the government and the people because the regime's response to the famine was slow and ineffective. The intelligentsia grew disillusioned with the Tsarist regime following the crisis. One member of the intelligentsia, Vladimir Lenin, claimed that the famine was a good thing as it heightened tensions between the government and its people. Lenin would later become the leader of Russia's most radical Marxist group, the Bolsheviks, and Lenin and the Bolsheviks will become incredibly relevant in future videos. Leon Trotsky, another revolutionary, pointed out that peasants were, quote, snatched from the plow and hurled straight into the factory furnace, which increased the amount of workers in Russian cities. Now, since the Bolsheviks and also the Mensheviks believed largely in a proletariat revolution following Marxism and Marxist thought, this increased the likelihood of a proletariat revolution. By having all these people who were affected by the famine move to the cities, it was increasing the number of workers in the cities. So let's have a look at the reigning monarch, Tsar Nicholas II. So Tsar Alexander III died in October 1894 of kidney failure. He was only 49 years old, and his son Nicholas II assumed the throne in 1894. Now, this was much earlier than Tsar Nicholas would have expected. He had not really been prepared for ruling. He believed, as everyone did, that his father, Alexander III, would live much longer and would train him to be Tsar. So in his own words, he said, "I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling." So if we go back to this idea that the direction of the Tsarist regime's policies and the confidence of its authority depended entirely on the individual character of the Tsar, Tsar Nicholas was a weak-willed and uncertain Tsar. So that means that the Tsarist regime and Imperial Russia was vulnerable to challenges. Nicholas married Princess Alexandra a week after the funeral of his father, meaning that Princess Alexandra was referred to as the bride in black because this was a time of mourning, and yet they got married a week after Alexander III died. Tsarina Alexandra, as she became known, you've got the Tsar and the Tsarina, was of German heritage, and this would later have significant consequences. Many hoped that Nicholas would bring about reforms in the way Russia was governed, but he committed to upholding, quote, the principle of autocracy as firmly and undeviatingly as did my late father. So there is no chance under Nicholas. He has no intentions of giving up any power, of making any democratic reforms, even though his grandfather actually had been quite liberal in his views, i.e., for example, through the emancipation of the serfs. That demonstrates his sort of liberal ideas and his openness to reform. Nicholas's father, who was a strong Tsar but was very unwilling to reform, had upheld the principle of autocracy, and Nicholas intended to do the same, even though he was a much weaker leader. Now, let's have a look at the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II and that's meant to say Khodynka field tragedy, not Khodynka, Khodynka. So the official coronation of Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra was held on the 14th of May, 1896. Now, this is the date that our area of study begins. The coronation celebrations included a huge open-air banquet for common people held at Khodynka Field on the outskirts of Moscow. Those attending were promised food and gifts. It was a time of celebration, our new Tsar, our new little father being coronated. Tens of thousands of people came to the celebration, but rumors of shortages of food and gifts created a mass panic. The police failed to keep order, and thousands of people rushed forward to where they thought the gifts were being distributed. Over 1,300 people were killed in the ensuing crush, and up to 20,000 more were injured. So this was an absolute tragedy. On the day of the Tsar's coronation, the common people, many of them died, many more were injured in this Khodynka Fields tragedy. Now, upon hearing of the tragedy, the Tsar and Tsarina were not sure what to do. The Tsar wanted to go and visit people in hospital to wish them well and to show that he is a gentle and loving Tsar. However, he was advised to instead attend a celebratory ball hosted by the French embassy. He listened to his advisors, and therefore his perceived lack of care led to him being dubbed by many as Nicholas the Bloody. So straight off the bat, Nicholas is seen as a uncaring and unloving Tsar, when the Tsar is meant to be the little father who protects the Russian people. So as our area of study begins, the Tsar is already on the back foot in the fact that he is, first of all, not prepared to be the Tsar, as he said himself. And secondly, he allowed this enormous tragedy to take place. Let's have a look at some historical interpretations of the Russian Empire and of Tsar Nicholas. So Orlando Fage is a historian who wrote The People's Tragedy, which is a very comprehensive book on the Russian Revolution, and probably the most comprehensive history of the Russian Revolution. Fage says, Nicholas was the source of all the problems. Straight away, he's saying that Nicholas was, everything came down to Nicholas. Russia gained in him the worst of both worlds, a Tsar determined to rule from the throne, yet quite incapable of exercising power. Robert Service said, the Russian Empire was deeply fissured, which means divided, between the government and the Tsar's subjects, between the educated and the uneducated, between rich and poor, between privilege and oppression. So, i.e., the empire already was incredibly divided, and there was a chance for it to become quite explosive between these groups. And Trotsky, who is a key revolutionary and a key figure in Unit 3, both causes and consequences of the revolution, he later wrote a history of the Russian Revolution, so he can be included in historical interpretations. He says, Nicholas II inherited from his ancestors not only a giant empire, but also a revolution. And they did not bequeath him one quality which would have made him capable of governing an empire or even a province or a county. Ouch. Leon Trotsky straight away saying that Nicholas is completely unfit to rule, not just an entire empire, but even a small county. So that brings us to the end of this video. It brings us to the end of our sort of contextualizing of the Russian Revolution. Our next video will look at the causes of the 1905 revolution, which is the first of 3 revolutions that we will explore in Area of Study 1. I hope you found this video interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.